Elena Rodriguez was folding laundry when the call came. Her husband's entire unit had been ambushed in enemy territory, 7 soldiers missing, presumed dead. The Pentagon told her to pray and wait, but Elena Rodriguez hadn't been just a military wife for the past 10 years. She'd been hiding in plain sight, and her husband had no idea he'd married one of the CIA's most lethal assassins. What she did next would turn a failed rescue mission into the most classified operation in military history. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story moves you, please consider subscribing to join our community of military history enthusiasts. The phone call that would change everything arrived at exactly 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Elena Rodriguez stood in her suburban Virginia laundry room, sunlight streaming through gingham curtains as she methodically folded her husband's military uniforms. The ritual had become sacred over their 10 years of marriage. Each crease pressed with precision, each fold executed with the same attention to detail that had made Captain Miguel Rodriguez one of the Army's most respected reconnaissance specialists. The sharp ring of her phone cut through the domestic tranquility like a knife through silk. Elena recognized the number immediately, the one that appeared on caller ID simply as official business, but never ever brought good news. She answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the practiced calm that military wives learned to project even when their world was crumbling. Major General Thomas Harrison's voice carried the weight of a man who had delivered too many death notifications over his 30-year career. Captain Rodriguez's unit had encountered heavy resistance during what should have been a routine reconnaissance mission in Afghanistan's Kandahar province. Contact had been lost at 0600 hours local time. 7 soldiers were missing, presumed captured or killed. Among them was her husband of 10 years, the man who still brought her coffee in bed every morning and left sticky notes with terrible jokes on the bathroom mirror. Elena's hands continued their mechanical folding as the general spoke, but her mind was already calculating. 8 hours and 43 minutes since last contact. In hostile territory, captured American soldiers typically had a 72-hour survival window before they were either executed for propaganda purposes or moved to secondary locations where rescue became exponentially more difficult. Miguel and his unit had roughly 63 hours and 17 minutes remaining. The general's voice took on the practiced tone of someone delivering the military standard response to such situations. Official rescue operations were being planned. Every available resource was being deployed, but Elena heard what he wasn't saying. The mission had failed because Miguel's unit had stumbled into something far more dangerous than intelligence reports had indicated. The enemy's strength and sophistication had been grossly underestimated, and now 7 of America's best soldiers were paying the price for faulty intelligence. For exactly 10 seconds, Elena allowed herself to feel what any military wife would experience in this moment. The crushing weight of helplessness, the terror of imagining what might be happening to the man she loved, the desperate hope that somehow, against all odds, he would find a way to survive until help arrived. Then Elena Rodriguez buried that woman forever and became someone else entirely. She walked with measured steps to the bedroom she had shared with Miguel for a decade, past the wedding photographs and vacation snapshots that documented their life together. The walk-in closet contained the wardrobe of a typical military wife: conservative dresses for official functions, casual clothes for barbecues and family gatherings, winter coats and summer sundresses, all carefully chosen to project the image of a woman whose greatest concern was whether the neighborhood potluck would have enough desserts. Elena moved past all of it to a section that Miguel had never paid attention to. Behind the evening dresses and winter coats hung a carefully curated collection of clothing in neutral colors, garments designed to help someone blend seamlessly into any crowd in any country. She pressed against a seemingly solid back panel, and it swung inward to reveal a hidden compartment. Communication equipment bearing no manufacturer's marks, tactical gear constructed from materials that left no forensic trace, weapons that had never appeared in any inventory system, their serial numbers filed away decades ago by craftsmen who understood that some tools were too dangerous to be officially acknowledged, and documents. Passports from 6 different countries, all bearing Elena's photograph, but different names, different histories, different lives that could be activated with a single phone call to numbers that changed weekly. The woman Miguel Rodriguez had married was named Isabella Santos. She had grown up in San Antonio, studied international relations at university, and worked for a humanitarian organization that provided disaster relief in conflict zones. Her background was thoroughly documented, completely believable, and entirely fabricated by the CIA's Identity Creation Division. But Isabella Santos had never existed at all. The woman now examining weapons in her bedroom closet was Elena Vasquez, though even that name appeared in no official records. For 15 years, she had been one of the Central Intelligence Agency's most effective deep-cover operatives, specializing in hostage extraction and high-value target elimination in regions where official American presence was politically impossible. She had operated under dozens of identities across 4 continents, speaking 7 languages fluently and capable of assuming any role from refugee aid worker to arms dealer to wealthy socialite. Elena's specialty had been the impossible mission. The hostages held in locations too sensitive for official rescue attempts. The terrorists who had placed themselves beyond the reach of conventional military operations. The intelligence assets who had been compromised and needed extraction from situations where one mistake meant death, not just for them, but for dozens of other operatives whose covers would be blown. She had retired from active service the day she married Miguel Rodriguez, trading a life of calculated violence for suburban normalcy. The transition had been remarkably smooth. After 15 years of assuming false identities, becoming a devoted military wife required no acting at all. She genuinely loved Miguel, genuinely enjoyed the quiet rhythms of domestic life, genuinely found satisfaction in community volunteer work and neighborhood friendships. The CIA had believed she vanished completely when she failed to respond to activation codes 3 years after her marriage. They spent considerable resources searching for their missing operative, never suspecting she was hosting book club meetings and organizing elementary school fundraisers just outside Washington, D.C. Elena had buried her past so thoroughly that even she sometimes forgot the woman she used to be. She would catch herself feeling genuinely shocked when action movies portrayed violence, as if she hadn't once eliminated 17 people in a single night in Beirut. She would struggle to open stubborn jars, having trained her muscle memory to suppress the reflexes that could snap a man's neck with casual efficiency. But muscle memory, like certain kinds of knowledge, never truly disappeared. It simply waited, dormant, until circumstances required its activation. Elena stripped out of her suburban housewife clothes and began the transformation that would take her back into a world she had hoped never to enter again. The process was methodical, ritualistic, each step taking her further from the woman Miguel had married and closer to the operator who had once been considered one of America's most valuable assets. She applied camouflage paint with the same precision she had once used for diplomatic receptions, but now the goal was invisibility rather than social grace. She selected weapons based on the tactical requirements of a solo infiltration mission into hostile territory. She chose communication equipment that would allow her to coordinate with assets she hadn't contacted in over a decade. Most importantly, she activated mental processes that had been carefully suppressed for 10 years. The hypervigilance that cataloged every potential threat, the tactical thinking that automatically calculated sightlines and escape routes, the emotional compartmentalization that allowed her to function efficiently while people she cared about were in mortal danger. By the time Elena finished her preparations, Isabella Santos no longer existed. The woman who had baked cookies for Miguel's unit and hosted barbecues for their families had been buried beneath layers of operational conditioning that transformed her into something far more dangerous. Within 6 hours, Elena Rodriguez was airborne on a military transport aircraft, her civilian identity replaced by documentation, identifying her as contractor specialist Maria Cruz. Her mission briefing was classified at levels that required presidential authorization, partly because of the sensitive nature of the operation, but mostly because officially Maria Cruz was a ghost operative who had been dead for 3 years. The intelligence briefing painted a picture more complex and dangerous than General Harrison had revealed in his phone call. Miguel's unit hadn't been conducting routine reconnaissance. They had been tasked with confirming the existence of a suspected chemical weapons facility that satellite imagery suggested was being operated by a terrorist organization with ties to hostile foreign governments. Instead of finding a small laboratory, they had encountered a fortress-like compound with defensive capabilities that indicated serious military engineering and significant financial backing. The facility was protected by guard rotations that suggested professional military discipline rather than typical insurgent organization. Most concerning of all, communications intercepts indicated the presence of advanced electronic warfare equipment that could jam American satellite communications and potentially compromise rescue operations. The official rescue mission had been canceled not because of political considerations, but because 3 separate military assessments had concluded that a successful assault would require at least 200 special operations personnel, close air support, and acceptable casualty estimates that exceeded what military leadership was willing to authorize for 7 soldiers. Elena understood the mathematics. In the brutal calculus of military operations, 7 soldiers, even exceptional ones, were not worth the risk of losing 50 or more in a rescue attempt that had less than a 30% probability of success. But the mathematics changed when one of those soldiers was the most important person in your world. The transport aircraft dropped Elena 47 miles from the target zone, in mountainous terrain that provided natural concealment but required a grueling approach march through some of the most inhospitable landscape on Earth. She moved through the darkness with the fluid economy of motion that marked a predator returning to familiar hunting grounds. Elena had operated in this region for 6 years during her active service, establishing relationships with tribal leaders who controlled smuggling routes and information networks that spanned 3 countries. She spoke Pashto, Dari, and Urdu with regional dialects that would identify her as someone with deep familiarity with local customs and politics. More importantly, she maintained financial accounts that could purchase services no official American operation could access. Over the years, Elena had cultivated a network of contacts who owed her favors, feared her reputation, or simply respected her as someone who kept her word and paid her debts promptly. The approach march took 18 hours through terrain that would have challenged mountain warfare specialists. Elena moved with the steady persistence of someone who had learned that survival often depended on the willingness to continue when continuation seemed impossible. She navigated by stars and landmark recognition, avoiding the few roads that might have shortened her journey but would have exposed her to observation. By dawn, she was in position to conduct detailed surveillance of the compound where Miguel was being held. The intelligence briefing had been accurate about the facility's defensive measures, but had significantly underestimated the sophistication of the operation. Through her high-powered scope, Elena observed communications equipment that was far too advanced for a chemical weapons laboratory. The satellite dishes and electronic arrays she could identify suggested capabilities that would allow real-time coordination with assets hundreds or thousands of miles away. Someone was running a major intelligence operation from this location, and Miguel's unit had stumbled into something far more significant than weapons manufacturing. Elena spent the entire day conducting systematic surveillance, mapping guard rotations, identifying weak points in the perimeter security, and most importantly, confirming the location where the American soldiers were being held. The tactical situation was challenging but not impossible for someone with her training and experience. What made the mission interesting was the man she observed directing operations from the Central Command building. Colonel Viktor Petrov had been dead for 8 years, 4 months, and 16 days. Elena knew this with absolute certainty because she had killed him herself during a classified operation in Ukraine that had earned her a commendation letter from the Director of Central Intelligence and a bonus payment that had funded her first year of married life. She still remembered the confirmation photographs that proved his elimination, documentation that had been essential for closing one of the CIA's most successful penetration operations against Russian military intelligence. Petrov had been responsible for at least 12 American deaths and the compromise of intelligence networks that had taken decades to establish. Apparently, the reports of his death had been greatly exaggerated. Petrov's survival explained several intelligence failures over the past decade, operations that had been compromised despite seemingly perfect security protocols. If he had been operating under deep cover for 8 years, feeding information to hostile governments while everyone believed him dead, the implications were staggering. Dozens of ongoing operations could be compromised. Hundreds of intelligence assets could be at risk. Elena made a decision that would have horrified her former CIA handlers and violated every protocol for hostage extraction operations. This wouldn't be simply a rescue mission to bring Miguel and his soldiers home safely. Viktor Petrov's 8-year deception was about to reach its permanent conclusion. She had killed him once for duty and country. This time, she would kill him for love and family. The assault began at 3:17 a.m. local time, during the shift change that represented the compound's most vulnerable moment. Elena had observed the guard rotation for over 30 hours, timing each movement and identifying the brief windows when sections of the perimeter were inadequately covered. She moved through the outer defenses like smoke, neutralizing sentries with techniques that left no sound, no struggle, no evidence of her passage. Each elimination was accomplished with the clinical efficiency of someone who had spent 15 years perfecting the art of silent death. By the time the guards inside the compound realized they had lost contact with perimeter security, Elena was already inside the main building, moving through corridors with the confidence of someone who had studied architectural plans and memorized every room, every stairwell, every possible route of advance or escape. What followed would never appear in any official report, partly because there would be no survivors to provide testimony, and partly because the methods Elena employed were too sensitive to be acknowledged even in classified documents. She found the American soldiers in an underground detention facility that had been constructed with the kind of attention to security that suggested permanent use rather than temporary holding. Miguel and his men were secured but unharmed, their captors apparently more interested in extracting information than inflicting immediate harm. Miguel's eyes widened in shock when a figure in full tactical gear and night vision equipment knelt to cut his restraints. Even through camouflage paint and military equipment, even after 10 years of marriage to someone he thought was a humanitarian aid worker, he recognized something familiar about his rescuer's movement patterns and body language. Elena handed him a sidearm and tactical vest without speaking, then moved to free the other soldiers with the same practiced efficiency. There would be time for questions later, assuming they all survived the next hour. The extraction took 14 minutes from the moment Elena breached the detention facility to the moment the last American soldier cleared the compound perimeter. During those same 14 minutes, she eliminated 11 hostile personnel and destroyed communications equipment that would have allowed the compound to call for reinforcements. During those same 14 minutes, Colonel Viktor Petrov discovered that his elaborate 8-year deception had reached its conclusion. Elena found him in the communications center, frantically destroying hard drives and satellite equipment in a desperate attempt to eliminate evidence of his operations. He looked up as she entered the room, and recognition dawned immediately in his eyes. The ghost from Kiev, he had called her during their first encounter 8 years ago. Today, that ghost had returned to finish business that should have been concluded long ago. Petrov was faster than most men, trained by Russian special forces and hardened by decades of clandestine operations. He managed to draw his sidearm and fire 2 shots before Elena reached him. Both shots missed. Elena's did not. The explosion that destroyed the compound occurred exactly 37 minutes after Elena and the rescued soldiers reached their extraction point, far enough away to avoid the blast, but close enough to observe the orange fireball that climbed into the pre-dawn sky. Official reports would later attribute the explosion to accidental detonation of stored chemical weapons, a conclusion supported by the complete absence of survivors to contradict the narrative. Elena Rodriguez returned to her Virginia home 48 hours later, arriving during the morning rush hour when her neighbors were leaving for work. She waved cheerfully to Mrs. Patterson, who was walking her elderly golden retriever, and collected mail from her box just like any other suburban housewife whose husband was deployed overseas. She spent the day cleaning her house with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else, erasing any trace of her brief return to operational status. The tactical equipment went back into its hidden compartment. The weapons were cleaned and secured. The communication devices were powered down and their batteries removed. By evening, when Miguel arrived home on military transport, Elena Rodriguez was once again exactly what she appeared to be, a devoted military wife who had spent 3 anxious days waiting for news about her husband's dangerous mission. Miguel came through the front door carrying flowers and wearing the smile that had made her fall in love with him 11 years ago. He also carried questions that would haunt him for the rest of his life about the identity of the person who had freed him from that cell in Afghanistan. As they sat together on their couch that evening, Miguel described his rescue in terms that made Elena's blood run cold. The operative who had freed them had moved with supernatural skill and lethal precision. She had known details about the compound's layout that suggested extensive surveillance and preparation. Most disturbing of all, she had demonstrated familiarity with Miguel's personal life that should have been impossible for a stranger. Elena listened with the patient attention of someone who had spent 10 years perfecting the art of being exactly who Miguel needed her to be. She asked appropriate questions, expressed suitable amazement at his survival, and provided the emotional support that any loving wife would offer her husband after such trauma. But she also observed him carefully, noting the suspicions that were beginning to form in his mind, the questions he was too afraid to ask directly, the growing awareness that his rescue had been far too sophisticated and personal to be the result of random military intervention. 3 weeks later, General Harrison called with questions about inconsistencies in the operational reports. The special operations team that had been credited with the rescue had never actually launched their mission. They had still been in the planning phase when Miguel's unit appeared at the extraction point, claiming they had been freed by an unidentified operative who spoke perfect Spanish and seemed to know intimate details about Captain Rodriguez's personal life and military service record. Elena continued preparing dinner while listening to the general's increasingly urgent questions. The destroyed compound had eliminated a major intelligence threat that military intelligence hadn't even known existed. Communications equipment found in the rubble was far too sophisticated for a terrorist organization, and forensic analysis suggested the involvement of state-level actors with advanced technical capabilities. Most puzzling of all, 7 rescued soldiers insisted they had been saved by someone who didn't officially exist, someone with training and equipment that exceeded anything available to standard military units. Elena suggested diplomatically that some things were better left unexplained. The soldiers were home safe. A significant intelligence threat had been eliminated. Perhaps that was sufficient outcome for everyone involved. The general pressed harder, asking how someone might thank the person hypothetically responsible for such an outcome. Elena recommended letting such a person live quietly with their loved ones, without asking too many questions about things that were better left classified at levels above his clearance. The conversation ended with mutual understanding. General Harrison would file reports that satisfied military bureaucracy without raising questions that might prove embarrassing for multiple intelligence agencies. Elena Rodriguez would continue being exactly what she appeared to be, a devoted military wife who had never been anywhere near Afghanistan. But the questions from Miguel continued, growing more specific and more troubling as time passed. He began noticing things about his wife that he had overlooked during 10 years of marriage. The way she moved through their house at night, silent and purposeful, her uncanny ability to identify potential threats in crowded places, the precise way she handled knives while cooking, with economy of motion that suggested extensive training. Most disturbing were the moments when Elena would stare into space with an expression Miguel had never seen before, calculating and distant, as if she were solving complex problems that involved life and death decisions. 6 months after his rescue, Miguel finally asked the question that had been haunting him since that night in Afghanistan. He asked Elena directly whether she had any connection to the person who had freed him from that compound. Elena looked at him with the same patient love she had shown throughout their marriage, but Miguel glimpsed something in her eyes that reminded him of the figure in tactical gear who had cut his restraints in that underground cell, something dangerous and competent and utterly lethal. She told him that she was his wife, that she loved him more than life itself, and that she would do anything to protect him. Everything else, she suggested gently, was just details that didn't matter as long as they had each other. Miguel never asked the question again. Elena Rodriguez continued her life as a suburban military wife, hosting book club meetings and organizing charity drives. She volunteered at the elementary school and maintained friendships with other military spouses who valued her practical advice and steady temperament during deployments. Only she knew that somewhere in classified files, a ghost operative had been marked as permanently retired and presumed dead. Only she knew that retirement could become temporary if the people she loved were ever threatened again. In her bedroom closet, behind the false panel, the equipment waited. Communication devices that could activate networks spanning 6 continents, weapons that could eliminate threats with surgical precision, documents that could transform her into any identity necessary to complete whatever mission circumstances might require. Elena Rodriguez had spent 15 years serving her country in shadows, protecting national security through methods that would never be acknowledged or honored. But the mission that mattered most had been personal, bringing her husband home alive. Some secrets were worth keeping. Some battles were worth fighting in silence. And some people were worth sacrificing everything to protect. The ghost who had once been Elena Vasquez was truly retired now, buried beneath layers of genuine love and domestic contentment. But ghosts, by their very nature, could always return when needed. Miguel Rodriguez kissed his wife goodnight and told her about his plans for the weekend. Elena Rodriguez listened with the complete attention of someone who had chosen love over duty, family over country, and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived over the adrenaline rush of a life spent eliminating threats in foreign countries. But sometimes, late at night, when Miguel was sleeping peacefully beside her, Elena would lie awake, remembering the weight of weapons in her hands and the satisfaction of protecting people who would never know her name. The world was full of invisible guardians, she knew. People who looked exactly like everyone else until the moment extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary responses. Elena Rodriguez was one of them. Retired but never truly gone. Ordinary except when ordinary wasn't enough.